Welcome to Academic Integrity, Urgent and Emerging Topics. This is the final webinar in the fall part of our series, which runs through the entire academic year. If you're interested in our series and upcoming webinars, then you can check out the ones that will be coming up in the 2021 winter term. At least it will be winter here in Canada. If you're joining us from somewhere else, maybe you have nicer weather than we do here. And I'd like to open today's session with an introduction. My name is Sarah Eaton. I'm the Educational Leader in Residence at the Taylor Institute, and my home faculty is the Workland School of Education. And we'd like to welcome you and let you know that the University of Calgary is situated on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. And I would also like to acknowledge that the City of Calgary is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta in Region 3. A little bit of housekeeping before I hand things over to our presenter today, that you'll note that your participant microphones are muted during the session. We welcome your questions. Please use the text chat box, which you will find in a floating toolbar, probably along the bottom of your screen, though it might be on the top depending on the kind of device that you're signing in from. And our presenter has let us know that he welcomes your questions throughout the session. And just before we get started, I'd like to pitch the following webinar that we have coming up in January that will kick us off with our winter term, and that will be called None of the Above, Integrity Concerns of Standardized English Language Proficiency Tests. So we won't be naming any particular products, but generally talking about ethical and integrity matters related to standardized English tests that students would use, for example, to apply for admission into a program. So if you're interested in that, that will be on Friday, January 8th. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to our presenter today, Dr. Joel Reardon, who's from the Department of Computer Science at the University of Calgary, and he's going to talk to us about cryptocurrency and contract cheating. Joel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And yes, as I had mentioned earlier, I invite your questions. I'm happy to get them. Just as a note, I have my chat buried in here. And so if you send me a private message and I look at the chat, it'll probably get projected to everyone if you just saw me open my chat. So just keep that in mind that there's no sending me a private message if I want to look at the chat here. But I won't be monitoring it as well. So please just maybe if one of the moderators sees a question, feel free to just interrupt me and I can take them. So I'm not too familiar actually with contract cheating. So this was more or less a new topic to me, but I have done lots of work with regards to cryptocurrency blockchain type stuff. So I'm familiar with that. And what I found interesting was that in my mind, essay mill was like a pejorative term. It would be like where you buy a dog and it's called puppy mill. Like I was surprised by how non-shameful these companies are in a sense. And then just yesterday, because my TAs were a bit behind in marking, I was marking one of the assignments and I found some extremely strange answers. And it led me to realize that, my goodness, all of my assignments that I've ever given out to my students in this course are all online. Thankfully, the first line of the answer for one of the expert answers was available, which allowed me to identify immediately the students that had the bizarre out of left field answer to the question. So I guess at least on a positive side, the work product is not that great. But even just that the questions include the number of marks not being redacted or the entire assignment. As I must say, I'm assuming that everyone in this audience finds this extremely familiar and normal in this, but I was definitely quite taken aback at the depth and scale of this copyright infringement and contract cheating that's occurring at the moment. So yeah, experiential learning before the day before this lecture. So there has been some work in trying to resolve these sorts of issues, and Australia has decided to put people who do this in jail, not the cheaters, but the people who facilitate the cheating. And this is definitely an interesting and probably an excellent approach, because if you're going to, in a sense, make something illegal, you can make the people who are actually profiting off of it, the ones who are actually doing it in a sort of organized criminal sense, having stiff penalties for that would serve as a strong discouragement. And sure enough, some evidence appears to suggest that at least the public-facing essay mills are ending their operations in Australia, because of course, if you're risking jail time for this, it's no longer a just plausible deniability for, oh, I'm helping students learn type of thing. It's no longer worth that risk. And there's as well some statement of PayPal saying that they're going to reject these essay writing firms, so they're going to no longer process payments for that. And this sort of raises an interesting question as well, because in a sense, if something isn't illegal, if the government says this is fine, then I kind of feel awkward about monopolistic companies refusing to make payments for it, right? We have Visa and MasterCard and that's it. And so it's somehow strange that this monopolistic world of payment mechanisms can effectively act as moralistic decision makers as to whether or not something should be allowed. I think it should be illegal and it should be at the government level, and then of course, not these companies will automatically stop processing it, as opposed to them deciding on their own what transactions should be allowed and what transactions shouldn't be allowed, right? But even still, you can make things illegal, but it won't stop the market demand. And the illegal drugs market is an example of that. You can't just make something illegal and suddenly it just disappears overnight. And so, to an example on this front is WikiLeaks. So if you're familiar with WikiLeaks, you may know of it as being part of basically in Trump's orbit and part of his election campaign. And people in the Trump campaign were talking with WikiLeaks to get dirt on Hillary Clinton, and it was all pretty bizarre and strange how much of a cheerleader WikiLeaks was for Trump. But before this campaign 4 years ago, there was another time when WikiLeaks was more releasing huge amounts of documents from governments, and it sort of had a journalistic ethic and purpose behind it. And one of their major stories was the cables, the diplomatic cables. And these were a series of unredacted intelligence communications going on between embassies, so ambassadors/spies being sent back to the State Department, unredacted in the sense that they were frank and they were straightforward, and they were just giving field reports from all over the world to the US Department of State. And so they were published in their entirety, and there was lots of fallout from them. For instance, head editor at Al Jazeera was found to be intentionally editing any story involving children dying in Iraq from US actions because he was in the pocket of the US. And so he was released from that job after this was uncovered. And there was a large number of cables as it relates to corruption in Tunisia. And one of the scale and the depth of this corruption was regarded to be a starting point for the Arab Spring. And so Arab Spring, where it looked for a moment like there might be democracy all over the Middle East, and it unfortunately didn't turn out that way. But it was seen that the cables themselves, the WikiLeaks' work, as well as The Guardian, which did a lot of the journalistic effort to contextualize that, served as a catalyst for the protests in Tunisia, which began the entire Arab Spring. So the US government did not like that WikiLeaks published all of these unredacted cables. They were not a fan of this amount of transparency suddenly being given to all these confidential, top secrets, and so forth, classified materials being available to any journalist who wants to have a look at it. And so there was promptly a number of consequences there. So one was that Julian Assange, who had a Swiss bank account, that was closed. Now, I actually lived in Switzerland at the time, and when I read this, I found it quite reasonable because contrary to the sort of public myth, you can't just open a bank account in Switzerland if you're not a resident. It's not that easy. I mean, maybe if you're super rich or something like that, it's okay, but a regular person can't just do that. And he had lied about his residency status, and so that was grounds to just close the account when they realized that he was not actually a resident. So I found the closing of the Post Finance account quite reasonable when I was there, but nevertheless, there's certainly grounds to believe it was result of some sort of pressure from the US to do that, because this was an account that was collecting donations to WikiLeaks. And as well, Visa and MasterCard moved to stop collecting donations, stop processing transactions for WikiLeaks as well. So again, it wasn't that WikiLeaks was classified as a terrorist organization and that it was a criminal offense to actually give them money. There was nothing wrong implicitly with giving them money. There was no crime committed to donate to WikiLeaks. It was just that these payment providers decided that they just won't do it. So like in a sense, they're deciding on our behalf what they think is allowed to be donated to and what they think isn't allowed to be donated to, which is sort of a strange position that they decided to place themselves into. And two interesting consequences of this is that first, there was a denial of service attack or distributed denial of service attack against some of these, the entities like Post Finance, which closed his account, and MasterCard.com. And the denial of service attack is effectively that when you go to a website, for example, you're consuming some of their resources. So if you make a web request, it goes to a server, and then they provide service to that request. So they have a computer. That computer then has to consume some resources, network resources, and computational resources to actually serve that request. And the amount of resources is relatively small, and so it's not a problem. The internet generally works. But when suddenly thousands or millions of people are sending, in effect, fraudulent requests, so they're requesting information from a server, but they don't actually care what the information is, and then as soon as they get it, they request it again and again and again and again. They're trying to consume all of the resources of that server. And so if you imagine that the amount of requests is greater than the amount that the server can handle, which of course it is just a balance of there's only so many requests, say 1,000 a second it can serve. If the incoming rate of requests is higher than that, it'll effectively take down the website. It just can't respond to legitimate requests because there's so many illegitimate requests, and there's no discrimination. You can't tell apart a legitimate one from an illegitimate one. They all look the same. They're all just requests, and this is the mechanism of a denial of service attack. So this was, it's almost certainly not the first time that this sort of politically motivated denial of service attack occurred, but it stood out for me, at least, when it happened, that this was really, in a sense, this notion of hacktivism, where people had decided what was happening was wrong, and they went and they did a denial of service attack out of spite, out of a political motivation, to sort of make this point. They weren't trying to make money off MasterCard. It wasn't an organized crime. It wasn't a disinformation campaign or anything like that. It was purely retaliatory for having done something. They're going to sort of point their weapon, in a sense, and do this purely out of political motivation. The other thing that happened at this time was that WikiLeaks then just accepted Bitcoin donations instead. And this was a year after Bitcoin was created, which means that the value of Bitcoin had yet to balloon to 10,000 times or 100,000 times what it was at this time. So WikiLeaks actually managed, assuming that they didn't spend it all or convert it all into real money right away, they probably made an enormous sum of money through all of these donations by accepting Bitcoin, as opposed to, because they, in a sense, they just couldn't accept MasterCard anymore. So suddenly, if you wanted to donate to WikiLeaks, the only way to do it was to take your money, figure out how Bitcoin works, convert it into Bitcoin, and then donate it to WikiLeaks through Bitcoin. So this served as a sort of initial catalyst for that. So what is Bitcoin? And to that, what is money? And so money, right, is like a letter with a line through it. That's the general way it looks like. And it has three fundamental properties. We have that it is a store of value, meaning that if you have more than you need right now, you can keep it and it won't rot, it won't go bad, you can use it later. It's not like a card that just constantly loses value. It exists and you can sort of hold on to it in a sense, and it may fluctuate, but it's not going to change so dramatically that it's not worth holding it as is. Second property of money is that it is a medium of exchange. And in this sense, it's like you could think of it as money is what you pay your taxes in, because whatever you pay your taxes in, and according to robocalls, it's Amazon gift cards for Canadians pay their taxes, but it's whatever you pay your taxes in is going to be useful as money. So a medium of exchange as well would be just the ability to buy something with it that is universally accepted, or at least within a particular regional universe it's accepted, and you're able to just make use of it as an exchange of wealth so that you can purchase items. And the final property is that it is a unit of account, meaning that you can measure things in terms of it. Right? You might like snowboarding, but you wouldn't measure your salary and how many lift tickets you can get with it. That's not a sort of how we would measure the amount. But instead, we have a metric. We can say this costs more than that, or this is twice as much as that. So this is the sort of three fundamental properties of money. And I realize we haven't explained Bitcoin yet in full, but Bitcoin, in a sense, achieves these three things to some degree. So it's a store of value. It does fluctuate wildly. It's not a reliable store of value. I've never invested in it or used it, so full disclosure there. But it's not something that's so clearly broken that it won't hold its value. At least for the decade it's been around, it has managed to retain its value, if not increase it dramatically. It is a medium of exchange in the sense that there are merchants who accept it. You can't pay taxes or rent or things like that, but there are merchants, there are cafes that will take it. And so it's not like the most useful form of currency, but it's not so useless that you can't do anything with it. You can actually, it's not something you just hold and that's like an asset, like a Rembrandt or a Picasso, but it's rather something that you can actually use if you were so motivated. And of course, it is a unit of account because there are markets, they trade markets, the markets are liquid, so you're able to convert it into US dollars. There's a market price at any particular point in time, and that means that insofar that you can measure something in US dollars, you can get the market exchange and measure it as well in Bitcoin. So to a degree, it does have these sort of three properties of money. And as for being a payment mechanism, so we can look at different payment mechanisms. We have cash, which is the standard payment mechanism, or at least it used to be. And we have promises, which is like the old-fashioned way of doing payments. And the promises could be debts or gifts or checks, these sorts of things, right? Before we had money, we would just have debts to each other and promises and so forth like that. And then there's credit cards, which is, as a payment mechanism is this, in a sense, the similar sort of way of as a promise, but there's now an intermediary towards that promise. And we can add Bitcoin in here as well. And of course, this isn't a comprehensive list of every sort of payment mechanism, but it illustrates the point that I want to make, which is that promises and credit cards, this involves some sort of trust relationship, right? If you're paying for lunch by taking turns, right, this is a sort of gift/debt based payment mechanism that exists between two people, and you sort of need to have trust that you're going to see them again. And similarly with credit card, it's not that the merchant trusts you if you go to a store and pay with credit card, but rather that the credit card company stands in for you and says, oh, they trust the credit card company, and the credit card company, or rather they don't need to trust the credit card company. The credit card company pays them straight away. And then the user of the credit card has a huge trust relationship with the credit card because they know everything about them. They know their credit history and credit worthiness and all this sort of stuff. But cash and Bitcoin have no trust relationship between them. So they are immediate payments. They're irreversible payments. If I give someone $10, I can ask for it back. But unlike a credit card where I can actually file a complaint and maybe get it back and reverse the charges, for cash, it's up to the goodwill of the person to whether or not they give it to me back. And it would be the same with Bitcoin. Once you make a transaction occur, once you give someone some Bitcoin, that they now have it. And it's up to them whether or not, how they spend it, who they give it to onwards and so forth like that. So in this sense, there's no trust relationship. And another way of thinking about it is that in this sense, it is anonymous, right? If you go and you pay with cash somewhere, you can have no need for verification of your identity. There's no need to worry about that. If I try to pay with a check, they might say, well, we don't know you, we don't know if this check is any good, so we're going to get some information from you before we accept this check. And having this sort of anonymous property makes these transactions also, in a sense, uncensorable, in that I might disagree with how someone else spent their cash, but if I have that cash that they did to do something bad, there's nothing I can do about it. The cash is still worth the same, even though it came through a bad channel or something like that. And it has the same value despite having that occurred. So you can't stop a transaction being done with cash insofar that it does exist. Now, another dimension to this is whether or not they work online or offline. So in an online sense, we have credit cards and Bitcoin. They both work over the internet. You can go to an e-commerce website, put in some information, and with your credit card, give them your credit card information, and you'll be able to do this transfer without actually having to physically meet this person and give them an envelope filled with cash. And cash and promises, of course, don't typically work that well over the internet. So instead, we have this second dimension now where credit card and Bitcoin, these are sort of online payment mechanisms. So if you were in fact looking for a trust-free online payment mechanism, you would then basically settle on Bitcoin or in something in the similar nature to that. So a key property of Bitcoin and cash, as I mentioned, it's this censorship resistance. It's this idea that you can't prevent a cash transaction or a Bitcoin transaction from occurring because there is no central authority or payment intermediary who's in charge of deciding what transactions are allowed and what transactions are not allowed. And even if there was a government entity that was saying, no, you can't use this, you can't buy drugs, for example, you can't buy essays. If the government were to establish a prohibition on these particular payments, you still can't prevent someone from taking out cash, using cash and giving it to somebody else, and then accepting that cash and giving that cash and putting that cash in the bank or wherever they want. And the same holds for Bitcoin, in the sense you can't censor these transactions from occurring, even if they're occurring for something you don't want them to be buying or something to that effect. Right? You can make something illegal, but of course it doesn't eliminate the market. It just changes the market. It changes the dynamics of the market, but it doesn't remove the market. So a little bit of the historical context of Bitcoin. It was introduced in 2009, and there had been before that a variety of proposals for what are called digicash type things, anonymous payment systems, and none of them really caught on. There was the original proposal actually very nearly got introduced into Windows 95 and would have been part of every single computer effectively. And it was anonymous cash-like payment. You could do microtransactions. And I could imagine that if that had actually gone through, the entire internet as we know it might be different. Because right now we're in an internet where advertising and tracking, behavioral tracking pays for everything. But the actual amount that these things cost would be relatively small. And if you just went to the New York Times and instead of being bombarded with ads, you just paid a tenth of a cent to read a news article, at the end of the month, you might look at your internet bill and it would probably be less than the amount that you paid the cable company or Telus anyways. So the entire internet might very well be different if we had these microtransactions available when it was being created. Now, the previous proposals for this digicash involved, in a sense, withdrawing a banknote from the bank and then giving this banknote to somebody else, effectively giving them the serial number of a banknote, and then that other entity redepositing it into the bank. And the risk there is with double spending. And the idea there is that, well, if I give someone a $20 bill, that's one thing. But if I just read them the serial number, they don't have that $20. I could read that serial number to somebody else. And this idea that digital goods can be trivially replicated. So the idea behind these digicash systems was that if you did withdraw money, give it to somebody else and they deposited it, the bank could not tell the bill that they gave out from the bill that they received. To the bank, it looked different, and that's how you achieved anonymity. But if you tried to double spend it, the bank would detect that and identify you exactly, and then there could be just a legal repercussion that you did this double spending, and that's a form of fraud. So Bitcoin, however, was entirely outside of this academic tradition of anonymous payment systems. It worked fundamentally different. And it was largely ignored by academics for many years. It probably was 3, 4 years before there was even preliminary work thinking about Bitcoin, even though the original paper had an abstract and looked like an academic paper and had a design based on all this sort of cryptographical building blocks. It was more or less ignored for some years, and then suddenly now there's conferences about it and all this sort of stuff. So the other thing, and this is just a page of some quotes that I pulled from this introductory paper that describe how Bitcoin works. And the author writes that financial institutes suffer from inherent weaknesses of the trust-based model, and that they want completely non-reversible transactions, but they're not possible. And as a result of, for instance, credit cards allowing reversals, it forces merchants to require more information from customers than would otherwise be necessary. Because if you can't trust that someone could just reverse the transaction, then you need to get more information. And they writes that cash works fine for non-reversible transactions, but it's not electronic. You can't use cash over the internet. So the goal was to have an e-payment system based on a cryptographic proof instead of trust. So remove the trust, remove the central authority that can decide things, remove central authority that can affect monetary policy as well, and instead just have a completely decentralized system based on cryptography as opposed to some just trusting some entity. So from the very start, it had this like anti-bank anarchistic feeling to it. And this was because of the context of the time. It started shortly after the financial crisis began. And this was a time with capital controls. If you lived in Iceland, you couldn't effectively travel anymore because you weren't allowed to take any money out of the country. There was trade halting, so stock markets were losing too much money, so they just stopped allowing trading. Which, you know, I realize is probably useful, but to me it seems strange because either it's the people who think the free market solves everything who are the ones that as soon as it doesn't want, oh, it'll stop, it's not fair, stop the trading, we're losing too much money. So I've always found that a bit strange how you can hold both views, that the free market works, but then it makes sense to not allow trading anymore for some reason, even though there's someone who wants to buy and someone who wants to sell at this moment in time. And as well, bailouts, the creation of trillions of dollars out of nothing that didn't reflect an actual value on the planet that existed at that moment. So this was a sort of historical context for Bitcoin. And the idea was that it was premised on the idea that money was something to fight over. This money is supposed to be a scarce resource that you strive to control and hold. And you know, it was the first scarce digital resource, because before then, the problem was you could just copy everything. And now Bitcoin became the first thing that you couldn't actually copy. It was the first scarce digital resource. And it was designed to have a deflationary system. So it's designed that it will run out. There's a finite amount of Bitcoin that'll ever exist. And once it's all there, it's all you can do now is fight over who has it, as opposed to create more wealth. So if we created some wealth of the world, we wouldn't create new money to represent that wealth. We'd have to reassess how much Bitcoin is worth. And so if you're a grown-up who understands that money is a tool that creates markets and coerces people to do things that work in favor of what you want to have happen in the world and make the world a better place, and that money isn't really real, it's just the thing we all sort of agree is a shared hallucination and it somehow works, then you'll find Bitcoin silly. And indeed, I also find it silly. I wouldn't want an economic system based on this idea that we have a finite amount of wealth and now we just fight over it. And it could have been different. Like there could have been a 2% inflation, for instance. They could have said, well, 2% inflation seems to work. That's what every central bank tries to get. So it could have just made it differently. It really would be a line of computer code that would change to say, well, instead of there being a finite amount every year, we create 2% more. And then you just have 2% inflation, just like the rest of the central banks try to have. But this crypto anarchistic idea of, well, no, these central banks have gone too far. We're creating too much money out of nothing. We need to actually have something that keeps the value. This was the sort of fundamental ethic behind it, right? And the lack of any central authority that dictates monetary policy is part of this appeal. No one can just create more money because it's convenient or for whatever reason, because they want to avoid a recession. It's just now we have something you can buy and hold on to, and the government can't dilute it. That was the sort of idea. And we'll get to the blockchain, which is how the data for Bitcoin gets stored. But I just will point out that the very first transaction, in a sense, that occurred in Bitcoin it's an extra data field in it. So it's just like, in addition to being transaction information, it's also just encodes some data. You can see in the middle on the right, it's a quote from the newspaper Times, January 3rd, 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout of banks. So this is like a sort of hidden, not really hidden, but hidden in plain text message that really shows that like the thinking behind Bitcoin was really a response to the financial crisis and the bank and government response to that. So Bitcoin as a commodity or as something that has a value or exchange rate, it typically increases when its use or function as a medium of exchange also increases. So Silk Road, which was an online drug market, was the first major thing that caused a sort of spike in Bitcoin's price, because now not only was Bitcoin just this curiosity to technically minded people who found it interesting, or to anti-central bank type thinking people, it was now it had a purpose. You could actually buy things with it that you couldn't otherwise buy. Right, donating to Wikipedia or WikiLeaks as well would be another example like that, where you couldn't do it another way. You had to do it with Bitcoin. So now suddenly there's a real market for Bitcoin, because now people actually want to get it so that they can use it. And if there's a demand, then the price will increase. So Silk Road was like an Amazon for drugs and other illegal stuff. And you could just go on and search and buy and do it all anonymously and have it delivered to your house. And this went on for quite some time. And when I lived in Switzerland, actually, there was a museum that had a art display. So some artists had created what they called a darknet shopper. And what they did was they wrote a program that had $100. It had a budget of $100 of Bitcoin per week, and it would randomly search these markets, these dark web markets, where it would find something randomly that cost less than $100 and order it and have it delivered to their museum. And when it arrived, they would take the transcript of the interaction on the network. So what the output of the program basically as it ran, it would put it on one side and put the item on the inside of this display case, and it will sort of raise these interesting questions like, who really committed the crime here? Like, if they didn't buy this stuff themselves, it was a computer program. The computer program itself would be free speech. So what actually happened? Where did the crime actually occur? Right. And so some of the things that they got, some original stickers, so you can just put these on items and make it look like they wasn't actually opened, because it's just a sticker after all. There was this one, this British gas bill, and you can see the font equals open symbol size equals 50 pixels. So the information about how to replicate a gas bill. And I just love the idea of the Swiss museum or the artists themselves, because they're coming from a civil law country where, when you move, you just tell the government, there's a government authority that knows where everyone lives, right? And why would a gas bill matter? But of course, as we in the common law tradition know, the gas bill is this fundamental thing of a citizen that shows that you're a decent citizen in good standing. You can take the gas bill and prove that's where you live, and that you should be able to vote here because you have a gas bill. So now the gas bill is shown that turns out that it's not that hard to create your own gas bill, it turns out. This is what the museum looked like after the police raided it. So they removed, you can see all the display cases are empty. But before that, they were filled with counterfeit goods and some a packet of pills and some other random things. So a question then is, was this Silk Road anonymous? Was it an actual anonymous market? Well, this is the price of Bitcoin when the owner was arrested. So obviously, to some degree, it was not anonymous, because the guy who ran Silk Road is in jail. So what exactly happened? Well, it wasn't a flaw necessarily with Bitcoin, but rather that some excellent investigative work done by someone who worked for the IRS. It was arrested at a San Francisco library, this particular one. And basically, they had found early statements that this guy had made under pseudonyms that sort of suggested that he knew about this market before it was actually public. And then they tracked it to this individual, and then they followed him and found him connecting to the Silk Road and running it in the library and arrested him. But despite that, despite it not being actually Bitcoin itself that exposed him, there is a fundamental difference between Bitcoin and cash in terms of its anonymity properties. And again, we have that digital data can be trivially duplicated. So if you want to spend some money, you will just, you still have the money that you claim to have spent, and you can spend it again because you're not actually giving up anything if you're doing it digitally. So now I have a bunch of slides that I had prepared for a blockchain 101 that I had given some years ago, and I haven't gotten around to actually redrawing them. So I did it on my Blackboard, and I'm just going to recycle them. But I'll just give a sort of like high level view of how the blockchain / Bitcoin actually works and why it has different sort of anonymity properties than cash would have. So blockchain is this data structure, and it was sort of named after Bitcoin. So Bitcoin came first, and then there was this elegant data structure that represented all of the transactions, and this became known as the blockchain. And the idea is there's a bunch of blocks, each block contains a bunch of statements, and they're all chained together. So every time you create a new statement, you insert it into a place. So you say that statement 3 is following statement 2. So every new statement reaffirms every statement that came before it. So you end up with an ordered sequence of statements. And so, for example, if we were playing a game of tag, you have a bunch of players and someone's it, and they tag another player, and then that person becomes it. The way this would work in a blockchain is that first you have an initial message, and the message could say Alice is it. So this is the start of the game. And then Alice tags Bob, and Bob tags Charles, and Charles tags Dan, right? So the game of tag is happening, and these are just statements. So the idea is that this blockchain is just storing an ordered sequence of statements. And these statements can say whatever they need to say. There's no, in a sense, rules to what is being said. You could say Charles tags Danielle, and we would know that this is invalid because after line 4, Charles is no longer it, so he would be ineligible to tag Danielle. So what is it? What would happen here? Well, we can just strike this. The statement itself just carries no meaning. It doesn't make sense. We can't reconcile it. But it doesn't mean it can't be said. It's just statements, right? As long as we agree on the order of the statements and we know all of the statements themselves, we can effectuate this game of tag. And so there's a sequence of statements, which would be the blockchain, the actual pieces of data, the incremental changes that are occurring. So we start with an initial empty state, and then we just have an ordered sequence of changes to that state that represent the new state of the world. And we can replay that at any particular point in time. So in the first line, there's a concept of who is it. And this is the sort of function we're actually trying to compute. This is the meaning we're trying to derive out of this sequence of statements. So Alice is it in the first round, Bob is it in the second round, Charles is it in the third round, Dan is it in the fourth round, and Dan would still be it in the fifth round because the tagging of Danielle was false. It was ineligible. It didn't affect the system. It didn't change anything. And so the idea is that we have this ordered sequence of statements that everyone agrees on. And if we have that, we can then compute some interpretations of it. We can compute some function that means something based on what these statements actually say. So the hard part would be getting everyone to have the same idea of the same exact state of reality. But once you have that, you can then just compute some functions and have it work more or less in a straightforward manner. So a point here then is, if you don't have the entire history, if you're missing some pieces of information, there's no longer a way that you can tell whether something was actually valid. At line 4, Charles tags Dan, but if you don't know whether or not Charles was it, you can't then conclude that Dan is it. If Charles wasn't actually it, you have no reason to believe the statement. So you need the entire sequence of statements from the beginning in order to draw any actual conclusions from the sequence, this ordered sequence of statements. So in the context of Bitcoin, we have that these statements are representing transaction data, statements about money. That a person has some money and then they give that money to somebody else and that person gives it to someone else. And the analogy to tag comes quite quickly. If you aren't having the money to give, that statement's then invalid and it would be rejected. But as long as the statements are valid, as long as that money that you're purporting to spend is in fact available to you, and you know all of the entire history, so you're able to make these assessments, you're able to know, oh yes, this person actually had this money, you can then compute a function of it. And the function that matters in Bitcoin then would be the distribution of wealth. So you look at every single message from the starting point of time, and you figure out how much money you have is basically how much money you received in that message minus how much money you would have spent in that message. And the resulting interpretation of this blockchain of information is then the distribution of wealth inside of among the users of the system. So in this sense, Bitcoin is just an application of a blockchain that stores this complete list of all of the transactions that occurred. So when someone gives you money, you then need to actually check that earlier they were given the money that they're claiming to be able to spend. Now, this part is actually the non-trivial part that would be a full lecture on its own to go through, because it is not a easily solved problem in computation and distributed computers, where you have a whole bunch of computers on the internet. They're all receiving different pieces of information. They might be lying to each other. They might be faulty. They might not receive all the messages. And actually solving this problem is the sort of technical accomplishment of Bitcoin that makes it interesting and worth academic study, because they solve this well-known, long, hard problem, and they did it without any initial trust. There's no central authority that you have to trust. It just, in a sense, manifests based on this idea of computational power being limited. And so I won't go into the details on that front, but the main point of how it works is that you need to know everything, because in order to assess the validity of any particular statement, you need to know the entire history of economic activity from day one in order to tell whether or not that's true. And the security feature of Bitcoin is that it's impossible to go back and change something. So once you get to a point where everyone agrees that something happened, by nature, everything that happened earlier, they also agree on, because every new statement reaffirms the statement that came before it. It's not just a new statement on its own, but it's a new statement on its own that says, plus I followed this previous statement, which followed this previous statement, which followed this previous statement, and so on back to the beginning of time. So once you have consensus on a particular history, you can't then go back and change it. And this is the computational limits to computable or hard functions to compute that's actually responsible for achieving that. And the sort of the main idea is that the only way to know if Alice didn't spend something is to just know everything Alice did, for example. So the only way to be able to convince yourself that some message isn't present is to simply know every single message, and then you can check, is this present or is this not present? So this seems much less anonymous than you would think, right? There's no anonymity in this sense. Every single transaction is public to everyone by design. So how is this anonymity claimed to occur? The anonymity for a Bitcoin is simply that the addresses that are involved in transactions aren't necessarily linked to actual people. So there's no Alice tagging Bob. There's just some random number giving $1 to some other random number, and these aren't actually linked. So despite not being linked, it's not the case that you can't actually figure out who they are. In fact, you can claim an address is yours. So here is a list of 11 addresses. These are sort of the top holding addresses of Bitcoin. I just searched for this, and you can see the addresses themselves. They just look like random weird strings. They correspond to public keys. So if you're familiar with public key cryptography, these are the public keys. If you know the corresponding private key, you can sign a message anyone can validate that the signature is correct. So it's kind of like being able to sign a document. Only you can sign the document, but everyone else can look at the document and see, ah, yes, that's Joel's signature. In this case, you don't know who the Joel is, but you can tell that it's a valid signature for this address. So the address is the public key, and you can validate anything signed with a corresponding private key. And if you search for some of these addresses, you'll see, oh, this actually is an actual place, because any company can say, I own this address. This is my address. For example, WikiLeaks, you can donate to them, and they say, this is our address. If you want to donate to us, donate to this Bitcoin address. And here's a 2D barcode that you can scan to make it easier so you don't have to type in this number. And this basically means that if you wanted to figure out how many people are donating to WikiLeaks, you could just search for how much money this address gets. And then that just tells you exactly how much money they're receiving. So in this sense, there's no anonymity because they've claimed that address, but there's no requirement to claim this address. So there's no responsibility or duty to claim an address. On their own, they just exist. If you wanted to claim it, you could. If you wanted to have a long-lived one, you could. If you wanted to change it every day, you could also do that. So one way to think about it, we have a whole bunch of these nodes. These nodes, would all be different addresses. And when you're looking at all of the information in the blockchain, you effectively see all of the transactions that occur, who gives money to who, and how much. So all of this is public. You know exactly where the money is flowing and who it's flowing, or the sort of entities, these addresses that it's flowing to. And for instance, suppose that you wanted to make a new transaction. You could, for instance, take the 3 Bitcoin that you received. So I'm looking at the center node 3 BBBC or BBC8. They're taking these 3 Bitcoins that they received, and they're paying 2.25 to one place and 0.75 to the other. So basically, they're spending all of the money they received. They received 3 at some point in time, and now they're spending it all at once. And it could be the case that each of these, they're paying themselves, right? All of these addresses belong to some human in a sense, or belongs to something. And that same thing can own more than one of them, and they can own as many as they would want. And so in the case where this entity in the center made these 2 payments, it could be that they just created a new address, paid it to themselves, and paid 0.75 because they actually bought something. So they paid the Bob B address some amount of money for something, and they paid the rest back to themselves. And at this point, they could even remove this old address forever. As long as no one ever gives it any money, it just, in a sense, ceases to matter. It ceases to exist. It's no longer relevant because it no longer has any money at its disposal. And this new address that they paid themselves into, they could do the same thing again. Pay 0.25 to Dan, pay the rest back to themselves, and remove this address from their history as well.
Joel, it's Sarah. Could I ask a question?
Yeah,
what you're describing, is this a form of money laundering kind of behavior?
So it's actually the design of the system is to work like this. So it certainly has, I believe, like someone who would be interested in money laundering would find this very interesting as a test bed to explore, because certainly money laundering would have occurred through this, and you have all the data. So if you had basically algorithms you wanted to test to try to find examples of money laundering, you could run it on here. But the actual way that Bitcoin functions is that when you receive money, you have to spend it all in the same at once. So you actually have to create a transaction that spends it all, paying a new account, basically yourself and the person you want to pay. So it looks like money laundering, but it's actually how it is designed. And so in that case, it might facilitate money laundering. And there's no way to tell who's Alice and who, like if Alice is paying themselves or paying someone else, aside from, well, if they're paying some well-known account, say a particular merchant, the price of a coffee, then probably the rest of the money was going back to themselves. So you could make these sort of inferences because there's all this data here, but there's no certainty, I guess is the way to think of it.
Okay, thank you.
And further, there's other ways to achieve more anonymity like properties. So there's this idea of a mix where a bunch of people pay into one central address, and that central address pays out everyone back, but with different coins. So you can imagine 100 people all put $1 in a jar, and then they all take $1 out of the jar, and now you can't link the dollar that went in and the dollar that went out anymore. So these are more deliberate attempts to do money laundering, or sort of hiding the flow of money through the system. And if you're familiar with the term a smart contract is just a computer program that you can't change how it works. So you could look at the code, you see what it does, and these sorts of mixes where everyone puts money in and everyone gets money out are done with smart contracts. So it's not the case that I say, hey, everyone pay me $100 and I'll launder your money for you, you can trust me. There's no central authority that you have to trust. It's just a computer program that runs. So everyone puts their money in, everyone gets their money out, everyone knows it'll work. No one's out any money, no one's ever exposed to any risk. But you get sort of a clean bill at the end. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
So this property might actually aim or protect against two harms that academic misconductors face. This property, this sort of pseudo-anonymity and non-anonymity. So blackmail and fraudulent services. So in the case of blackmail, right, we have this system right now where if you buy something on the internet, all you have to do is give your credit card and the date of expiration and the magic number on the back. And that's enough to make purchases in effect forever. You intentionally buy something from a merchant, give them this information, but there's really nothing stopping them from doing any kind of transaction with this information other than your trust that they won't do that and your ability to contact your credit card company and say these are fraudulent transactions. So in the case of contract cheating, we have this moral situation where a student has committed a reprehensible moral offense, but not necessarily a legal offense. There's no risk of jail or something like that. They've just committed an academic offense, which would be prosecuted through decredentialing them, for instance, or giving them a 0 on that assignment, or however it manifests. But there's no real legal risk. It's more of a moral failing. And this creates this ability to do blackmail because now we have, well, we know something about you and you don't want that to get out. And if you just pay us some money, we won't let that get out, or we won't, tell on you. And this is now a lifelong risk that an academic misconductor faces, because there is a lifelong chance that they could be decredentialed for having committed these offenses. So if, for instance, they've disputed the claims on the credit card, if, for instance, one of these contract cheating websites started just charging them every month and made it really hard to quit, and they tried to quit and they say, well, no, you can't quit, we're just going to keep charging you, and otherwise we're going to tell the university that you're doing this horrible thing, then they get stuck into this trap, and effectively there's no real way to stop it aside from the fact that blackmail is illegal, and so of course they could expose the wrongdoing. But if this is being done by not proper actors that pay taxes and so forth, but just simply through organized crime, then of course making it illegal wasn't going to change anything either. Now, interestingly, the use of Bitcoin actually would protect the misconductor, because in this case, the only way to spend money in Bitcoin is to sign a statement from your address that you control saying, I give this money to that person. Giving some money to somebody is a one item or one event that occurs, but you can't replicate it. You can't force someone to keep giving you money. You can't coerce them, aside from just convincing them in that sense that they need to keep giving you money, but you can't just take information they've given you and just keep replaying it over and over and over like a credit card would allow them to do. And so in theory, it would be possible for students to contract cheat without getting caught. It wouldn't be the easiest thing to do. You would have to be pretty technically savvy, and so that you would use Tor for all of your access to resources. So for instance, Tor is the anonymous web browsing. So if you're paying a subscription to Chegg and you connect to Chegg, they're going to know your IP address. And if they know your IP address, that's basically your identity. That's if you're using the internet to do anything, you're using the same IP address. You're coming from your home or your office or wherever. And that IP address is necessary so that information flows, that Alice can talk to Bob on the internet. The internet needs to know where to send the message to, otherwise there's no communication. So by just how the out of necessity, it's the case that anytime you connect, they would just know who you are. So even if you paid anonymously, you would still have to access all the resources anonymously. And of course, there's ways to do that. So assuming the user used Tor for everything, they use Bitcoin for every payment. If there's any communication, they don't use obviously their Calgary email address, because that would be crazy. They would use anonymous emails. It would be possible to implement contract cheating in a way that both parties are anonymous. No one knows who anyone is, but the actual money is exchanged and the answers come back, and everyone's happy except the professors. The other harm that would be faced is, of course, fraudulent services, because, of course, like in the case where I've seen it, it's usually easy to detect because the answers are wrong and you can figure out why, and a bunch of students have the same answers or something like that. But there's also cases where they'll just work doesn't come in time, and then suddenly you need extra days to submit your work because you're waiting on the contract cheater to give you your results or the answers, and there's really no control that's happening. There's nothing you can do to force them if they haven't done the work on time. As well, they might give lousy work. And the market itself is vulnerable to what are called Sybil attacks. So a Sybil attack is the idea that you can create fake identities. You can create thousands of fake identities on the internet. If you have a bad reputation, you can just shut down and open a new company with a new name. And you can do this just trivially on the internet by just assuming a new identity. Now, interestingly, you could have now with Bitcoin a sort of long-lasting relationship as an entity that has known to give good service, for example, or have excellent results. Because in the same way that WikiLeaks has a sort of fixed address that you donate to, if you want to donate money, you give it to this address. It could be the case that you position yourself in terms of academic misconduct, provider of services, and you just have this address and everyone knows, oh, this guy's good, he gives good results, he's like, whoever he is, you don't know who he is, but as long as you pay this address, you know that you're paying the same person who has delivered in the past, right? And of course, there's nothing guaranteeing that it's not one big long con that eventually they'll take all the money and quit, right? But as long as they are interested in maintaining their business, then they would have an interest in delivering on the results, and then they could, and word would get out that this one is a particularly good address, to pay money to because they deliver a good service. So in a sense, Bitcoin would facilitate against these two harms. Blackmail, because they no longer can be forced, or transactions can't occur automatically. It's really a deliberate action on behalf of the spender to actually spend money. And then there could actually be some sort of long-lived reputation systems despite having an anonymous payment mechanism on top of it.
Joe, we've had a question come in.
Yep.
The question is, if a student submits a contract cheated assignment via Turnitin, for example, which we don't use at UCalgary, but the question is, they're potentially identifiable from that point forward, question mark?
So what does that mean by Turnitin? That's like the anti-plagiarism, like,
yes.
Or is it? Okay.
Yeah, text matching software that we don't use. Text equivalent of Moss, maybe, something like that.
Mm-hmm. So yes, absolutely. So as soon as a student accepts this misconducted work, it could be the same work that's provided to others as well, and presumably would be. And then as soon as a student puts their name on it and says, this is my original work, I'm the sole author, I didn't cheat, and claims that, then of course it would be able to be detected, right? At this point, it's really just the matter of payment. So it's not going to appear on the MasterCard statement. There's going to be no financial records. MasterCard could stop accepting payments for these services, and the government could make it illegal. But nevertheless, as long as these sort of payment systems exist, the exchange of goods and services can still be facilitated. But then once the student puts their name on it and then it's seen that the same work was done elsewhere, then that would be detected. And I guess the only defense for the cheating student at this point is to have hope or trust that this won't be vetted or that the work won't be duplicated elsewhere. But that seems quite unlikely.
Okay, I think that answers the question, but if it didn't, maybe we can ask for further clarification. Thank you.
All right. So yeah, that's the end of my talk. So in summary, contract cheating is reprehensible. Everyone knows it. It's not a surprise. I can't imagine that a student who's literally paying money to receive an essay that's written on their behalf and then they put their name on it thinks that there's nothing wrong with it. But making it illegal and hard to do won't actually stop it. I mean, it can't hurt. Of course, anything will help. So if it is harder to do, or you have to go even further out of your way to do it, that'll discourage a chunk of people from doing it, and that would be great. But it's not going to, of course, stop it. You can't satisfy a market demand by eliminating supply, or making it harder to exchange supply, because the supply can always exist in a black market. And making making the payment anonymous and transactional, meaning that like you just pay the money, you get the work, and you're done. It can protect against the harms that the cheaters face, but actually doing it in practice, if it were the case that this were illegal, making it happen all the time, doing it perfectly, never getting caught, never accidentally revealing your IP address to the server that you're getting data from, never having them figure out who you are, that's non-trivial amount of work that isn't that I wouldn't assume would be within reach of everyone without training about how to actually be anonymous on the internet all the time. So it's unlikely that the students won't be harmed. It's still quite likely that whoever is doing this contract cheating service would be able to identify who these students are at some point. And certainly, like, if you just, for instance, if you ask, I need answers to these questions, and then you search these questions and see my website, and then you kind of figure out at least where the student is going to university. These anonymous payment systems like Bitcoin, they exist and they won't go away. So, and they shouldn't go away in the same sense that cash is an anonymous payment system. And the idea that every transaction that we ever do should be under audit by the government or some for-profit company that looks at every transaction we do, I sort of reject that. So in this sense, but even if opinions aside, they're just not going away. So it's here to stay. And so the question then is, well, what do we do with it? And I guess the only long-term solution that we have is to simply deal with the demand side, to make the demand side go away, instead of hoping that the supply side can be stopped outright. All right, thank you for your attention. I'm happy now to take further questions.
Thank you. I did have a question come in via a direct message to me, so I'll ask it on behalf of the person asking. And the question is, what evidence do we have that these kinds of anonymous online payments by Bitcoin are happening with regards to contract cheating? And then the second part of the question is, are students even aware that they could be identified by making credit card payments for contract cheating? So that's sort of two different but related questions.
So I have no data on either, so I can only speculate. I haven't seen any evidence that contract cheating is being done via Bitcoin, but insofar that any of these websites accept Bitcoin, then it stands to reason that they are, right? So if you go to a website and you go to pay and you see somewhere at the bottom, this is their Bitcoin address, it means they accept Bitcoin, which means that almost certainly Bitcoin's being used. And then you could actually just look at the blockchain and see exactly how much money they're making selling the service by Bitcoin. So that's the sort of interesting aspect to it being totally public, is that if you are interested, if you find one of these cheating websites, and maybe in Australia you'll find them because more likely because of this law that prevents them from being able to operate in the public market, if you found an address where they say this is how you pay us to this address, then you could actually search to see how much money they're making, which would be interesting to do, I would say. And the second question was about whether students are aware. And I mean, this I guess would be a matter of doing a human participant study to determine this. My intuition is that there's a great deal of knowledge or lack of knowledge as it relates to how much of a digital footprint people leave when they do anything on the internet at all. And it wouldn't surprise me that they don't think of their credit card transaction as being something that uniquely identifies them or something that they should have some concern about or something like that. And of course, even if they were to use a credit card, they could get a prepaid credit card, for example, that has just $100 on it, and then they can't, and no longer is tied to their identity. So there are other mechanisms that they could use, but my intuition is that the transactions would occur without them worrying too much about it being like potentially de-anonymizing them or even exposing them to the long-term risks such as blackmail and so forth, which I now plan to warn all my students about in courses that I teach going forwards.
Yeah, thank you for that. And there was an interesting article earlier this year from York et al. In Australia, not surprising, around blackmail and contract cheating. And they found that most students were completely unaware that this could happen to them. We have time for a few more questions for Joel. If there are questions, comments, kudos, feel free to use the chat box. Joel, I'm not sure if you can see your chat, but you're getting lots of kudos in the chat. Oh. This was so fascinating. There you go. I can see you pull up your chat box. Feel free to stop your screen sharing if you wish.
Thank you. Well, I'm happy that it was interesting to everyone and they enjoyed it. Yes, in the Swiss Museum, that was really cool. I'm glad a friend told me about it, and I went there, and it was really just fascinating to see how they had presented it, and although it was really just random things, and you had to sort of figure out the crime in that sense. It was like a puzzle. It's like, why is this pair of jeans a crime? And as well, that the interesting philosophical part, which is that who committed the crime aside from the person who provided the product, like who should the Swiss police arrest? The exhibitors, the person who wrote the code, the electrical, whoever provided the electricity so the code could run, right? There's a lot of chat now about looking through IP addresses during exams, etc. Yeah. I don't know if if all of this effort is being actually done, because in practice it's quite an effort. I just know from working and talking with the Tor community that it's quite an effort, and they to just teach human rights and political dissident type people how to use it correctly. So like that's an effort that Tor actually does, is go to China and teaches dissidents, here's how you use Tor correctly and safely so you can be protected. And it's like they try to make it as easy as possible, but it's still, and there's a saying in security, which is one click security is exactly one click too many, because it's going to be too much to deal with. So I would be less, I'm sort of, I guess, not extending a huge amount of generosity towards those who cheat. So I'm assuming that they're not also cutting edge and thinking extremely carefully about all of the details, because if they were, they would probably just be able to hack it through university in the first place and not need to resort to cheating. So my guess is that it is not widespread use of like cutting edge technologies in order to protect their identity.
So I'm just noticing that we have another question in the chat, and I'm actually going to read it out just since our chat is not going to be included in the recording, and just taking over for Sarah here while we're dealing with some technical issues. So someone is wondering in the chat, why is something like Bitcoin considered legit? Thinking about some cryptocurrencies like Quadriga that have been exposed as frauds, and basically why do we take Bitcoin seriously as a currency?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's no real reason. Again, as I said, I would not put any money in it. So don't get me wrong there. Just because I know about it doesn't mean I would encourage it being used. Um, but it's in the sense like, what is money and why do we have faith in any money? And so why do I believe that this $20 bill is going to be worth $20? And maybe that's not something that is true, aside from look at the past and it seems to have worked out. And the same argument would apply to Bitcoin. Um, there's certainly frauds and market manipulations and sort of pump and dumps and spamming people to buy, and then you sell, and like all of this stuff, sawtooth patterns in like their market price. But insofar that there's a market and people are paying, then the market is, and it's a liquid market, the market is just establishing the price of it that people are willing to pay at a moment in time. And if you believe that that price is going to be higher in the future, you would buy some and sell it then. And the idea though that it's a Ponzi scheme has come up a few times, and there's been like even prominent people, Wells Fargo CEO and some JP Morgan, some head there. And it's just absurd because it's not a Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme is a specific thing where you take money in and you use new money to pay out old people. And in this case, it's really just a market and it fluctuates. And there's people are willing to buy it at this price. People are willing to sell it at this price. And that changes over time. If you're an early investor and you sell, if new investors are who are paying you, but it's not that you're guaranteed a 5% return year over year over year. It's just that's what people are willing to pay for some reason.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Joel. So I do have one other question for you. So you talked a lot about supply and demand, really the industry that is behind contract cheating. And we've discussed this before in our webinar series. And you talked about how, there's so many workarounds for purchasing things from SA mills or engaging in contract cheating. And you discussed how reducing the demand is really one of the only ways that we can actually get past this. So how are you maybe trying to educate your students about this? And what are some ways that we can engage students in being aware of the things that are happening, maybe without encouraging them actually to go out and do it?
Yeah, I would say like, first, making it really hard to get away with it is probably the easiest. So if you do it once and then you're caught, you're hopefully never going to do that again, because the academic misconduct process is not pleasant. And I would hope that after a student goes through it once, that sort of scares them into not dabbling in that again. So making it that if you do this, you do get caught and there's consequences is probably the best way in my mind to reduce the demand side. And then what I do, I talk about academic misconduct. I spend easily 10 minutes about it in the beginning of the course, and I remind them frequently throughout, and it doesn't stop it at all. But the more I am able to discuss it and the more examples I'm able to say, like this happened, these many cases happened, this is like, and 100% of them were convicted, and like these are the offenses that they did, not specifics of course, but just rather like these are things you may think is okay, but they're absolutely not okay. And I will take it very seriously. Any offense is probably the only real option that we have to discourage it.
Thank you very much for that, Joel. And I do see a comment in the chat agreeing with you here that there tends to be a very low percentage of repeat offenders of students who do go through the academic misconduct process. So just agreeing with you there. I'm noticing that our questions have kind of dwindled here. So just wondering, Joel, if you have any kind of last final thoughts that you'd like to share with the group before we close off today's webinar.
No, nothing. I've prepared all the things I wanted to say, so.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Joel, for facilitating today's webinar. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure that everyone else did. I noticed so many positive comments coming in the chat. So thank you very much for sharing your wisdom and expertise on this topic. If you would like to attend other webinars in our series, Urgent and Emerging Topics in Academic Integrity, I encourage you to do so. I'm posting the link to the chat there once again, so that you can register if that is something that you want to do. and a recording will be available from this webinar. It will be posted approximately 1 week following this, just so we can go through some of the production things, but there will be a recording available so that you can share this with other folks. So I am going to close today's webinar and say goodbye to you all. And thank you everyone very much for attending today.